You wake to the sound of your mother's cough echoing through the single room where your entire family sleeps. The straw beneath you rustles as you shift, and already you can smell it, that familiar mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting thatch above your head, and something else, something sour and organic that seems to seep from the very walls of your hovel. Your stomach clenches with hunger, but there's another sensation too, an itch, always an itch. Your scalp burns with it, your armpits sting, and when you scratch, you feel the familiar bumps and welts that have become as much a part of your body as your own skin. Outside, a rooster crows, though dawn still seems hours away. Your father groans and rolls over, and you catch a whiff of his breath, teeth rotted down to black stumps, gums swollen and bleeding. Your little sister whimpers in her sleep, her face flushed with fever, her hair matted with sweat and worse thing. This is 1347 AD, in a village somewhere in northern France, and you are about to begin another day of surviving in a world where cleanliness is not just a luxury, it's an impossibility. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Water. Such a simple thing. Yet in medieval Europe, clean water was as precious as gold, and often far rarer. For a peasant family like the one we just imagined, the nearest source of water might be a well shared by the entire village, if they were lucky. More often, it was a stream or river that also served as the community's sewer, washhouse, and animal drinking trough. Guillaume de Montfort, a French peasant whose existence we know of through tax records from 1352 AD, lived with his wife Marguerite and their 4 children in a village called Beaumont-sur-Oise, about 30 miles north of Paris. Their water came from the Oise River, the same river where the village dumped its human waste, where animals were led to drink, where women washed clothing using soap made from wood ash and animal fat, when they could afford soap at all. The water Guillaume carried back to his family in wooden buckets was brown, not metaphorically brown, not slightly tinted, brown like tea, thick with sediment and microscopic life that would make a modern person violently ill within hours. Yet this was their drinking water, their cooking water, their washing water. Sometimes Guillaume would let the buckets sit overnight, hoping the worst of the mud would settle to the bottom. Sometimes there wasn't time. Medieval peasants understood that water could be dangerous, but their solutions were limited, and often made things worse. They knew that stagnant water bred disease, so they preferred running water. They didn't understand that the very act of their entire village using the same running water source for everything turned that water into a cocktail of death. They'd boil water when they could afford the fuel, but fuel, wood, or peat was another precious resource that most peasant families couldn't spare for something as mundane as making water safe to drink. Instead, they drank ale. Weak ale was safer than water because the brewing process killed many harmful organisms, and even children drank ale with their breakfast. A typical peasant family in 14th century England consumed between 3 and 5 gallons of ale per day, not because they were drunkards, but because ale was safer than water, and they knew it. But ale doesn't clean your body, and cleaning your body for a medieval peasant was an exercise in making impossible choices with impossible resources. Soap existed in the medieval period, but it was expensive and difficult to make. The process required animal fat, wood ash, and time, lots of time. A peasant family might make soap twice a year if they were fortunate enough to have slaughtered an animal and could spare the fat. More often they made do with sand, which was abrasive enough to remove some dirt but left the skin raw and bleeding, creating perfect entry points for infection. Agnes the soap maker appears in the records of Canterbury, England, in 1376 AD. She was one of the few people in her region who knew how to make proper soap, and her services were in high demand among the merchant class. But Agnes herself, according to a court record from her trial for theft, was described as unwashed and verminous, with hair so matted it appeared as one solid mass upon her head. The woman who made soap for others couldn't afford to use soap herself. For most peasants, washing meant wiping down with a damp cloth when water was available. Full-body washing happened perhaps once or twice a year, usually in preparation for major religious festivals, and when it did happen, it was an ordeal that left people weaker, not stronger. Picture Marie de Coucy, a peasant woman from a village near Reims, preparing for her annual Easter washing in 1289 AD. She saved precious fuel for weeks to heat enough water for a full bath. The wooden tub in her family's single room is filled with lukewarm water, that turned brown the moment she stepped into it. She has no soap, so she scrubs with sand and a rough cloth. When she emerges, her skin is red and bleeding in places. She has no clean clothes to put on. The clothes she wore into the bath are the only clothes she owns, aside from her Sunday dress which must be saved for church. Within days, Marie develops a fever. The scratches from the sand have become infected. Her family has no medicine, no understanding of infection, no resources to help her heal. She recovers eventually, but the experience reinforces what every peasant knew. Washing was dangerous. It was better to stay dirty. And dirty they stayed. Chroniclers of the period, usually monks or nobles who rarely interacted with peasants directly, still managed to record their observations. Brother Thomas of Ely, writing in 1298 AD, described visiting a peasant village during a famine. The people were so encrusted with filth that their skin appeared black beneath the grime. Many had sores that wept constantly, yet they dare not wash them for fear of worsening their condition. The children especially were pitiable, their hair so matted with mud and excrement that it was impossible to tell where their hair ended and their clothing began. But hair was perhaps the worst of all. Medieval peasants rarely cut their hair, partly for religious reasons and partly because cutting tools were precious and scarce. Hair grew long and became matted with grease, sweat, food scraps, and worse. Lice were universal, not just common, universal. Every single person, from the lowliest serf to the king himself, had lice. The difference was that nobles had servants who could spend hours picking lice from their hair, while peasants simply lived with the constant itching and the sores that came from scratching infected bites. Isabella Farnham, whose name appears in the manor records of Yorkshire from 1356 AD, was noted by the local priest as having hair so infested with vermin that they could be seen moving even during Mass. This wasn't unusual enough to be scandalous. It was simply worth noting because the movement was distracting to other worshippers. Teeth were another horror entirely. Medieval peasants ate coarse bread that wore down their teeth to stumps by their 30s. They had no sugar in their diet, which was actually protective, but they also had no way to clean their teeth effectively. Some used twigs frayed at the end, others used strips of cloth. Most used nothing at all. Roger the Miller, documented in the court rolls of Essex in 1312 AD, was described as having no teeth remaining in his mouth by his 40th year, his gums so swollen and infected that he could consume only pottage and ale. This was not exceptional. Dental pain was so universal that it was considered a normal part of aging, like grey hair or wrinkles. The breath of medieval peasants was notorious even among their contemporaries. A travelling merchant named Francesco di Marco, writing from London to his family in Florence in 1378 AD, complained that the common people here have breath so foul it could knock a man senseless. I have taken to breathing through my mouth when I must conduct business with them, though this brings its own torments. But the real nightmare wasn't what you could see, it was what you couldn't. Medieval peasants were walking ecosystems. Their bodies hosted communities of parasites that modern people can barely imagine. Lice in their hair, fleas in their clothing, intestinal worms that could grow to several feet long, scabies mites burrowing under their skin, and dozens of other organisms that fed off their bodies. A medical text from 1295 AD, written by a monk physician named Brother Albertus, describes treating a peasant woman whose belly was so distended with worms that she appeared to be with child, though she had not known a man. When the worms were expelled through purging, they filled a bucket and writhed like snakes. This wasn't metaphorical language. Medieval people regularly expelled parasites that were visible to the naked eye, and this was considered normal. Scabies was perhaps the most common skin condition, causing constant itching and open sores. The medieval understanding was that scabies was caused by corrupted blood or evil humours, so the treatment was often bloodletting, which made the victim weaker and more susceptible to other infections. Marguerite de Blois, a peasant woman from Normandy, whose name appears in a monastery's charity records from 1334 AD, was described as being so afflicted with the itch that she had scratched herself raw from crown to heel, her clothing stiff with blood and matter. The monks gave her food and shelter, but noted that they kept her separated from other petitioners, lest the corruption spread. Personal hygiene wasn't just about comfort or appearance, it was about survival. But the cruel irony was that many attempts at cleanliness made survival less likely, not more. Washing with cold water in winter could lead to pneumonia. Washing wounds often introduced more dirt and infection than it removed. Cutting hair or nails with dirty tools could cause serious infections. Women faced additional horrors. Menstruation was poorly understood and surrounded by religious taboos. Most peasant women used rags that were rarely washed and never properly sanitized. These rags were often shared among the women of a household or village, spreading infections from woman to woman. The rags were also used for other purposes when not needed for menstruation, as bandages, cleaning cloths, or even food wrapping. Eleanor Kemp, a peasant woman from Norfolk, whose story survives in a church confession record from 1301 AD, described her monthly suffering. "I am unclean 12 days each month, for the rags I must use breed corruption, and cause such pain that I cannot sit or stand comfortably, yet I dare not discard them, for there is no replacement." Eleanor died in childbirth 2 years later, likely from an infection that began with contaminated menstrual rags. Childbirth itself was often a death sentence, partly because of the complete lack of hygiene. Midwives delivered babies with hands caked in dirt and previous birth's blood. They had no understanding of sterilization and often used the same tools and cloths for multiple births without cleaning them. Matilda Shepherd, documented in the records of Canterbury Cathedral from 1289 AD, lost 4 children in infancy before dying herself from childbed fever after her 5th birth. The local midwife, Alice Miller, was known to have dirty hands that were never seen to be washed, summer or winter, according to witness testimony in a later legal proceeding. Yet Alice was the only midwife for miles around, and women had no choice but to trust their lives to her filthy hands. Even the most basic functions of human life were nightmarish for medieval peasants. There were no toilets, no toilet paper, no understanding of how human waste spread disease. Most peasants simply used a designated area outside their homes, often shared with their neighbors. In winter they might use a pot that would be emptied, eventually. The manor records of Whitby, Yorkshire, from 1298 AD include a complaint that the cesspit serving 12 families has not been emptied in 3 years, and now overflows into the well that provides drinking water for the same families. The local lord ordered the pit to be emptied, but there's no record that it actually happened. What did medieval peasants use instead of toilet paper? Sticks, stones, moss, leaves, corn cobs when available, or simply their hands. They might rinse their hands afterward if water was available, but soap was too precious to waste on such purposes. Personal possessions were another source of contamination. Most peasants owned only one set of clothes, which they wore continuously until the fabric literally fell apart. These clothes were never properly washed, occasionally dunked in a stream and beaten against rocks, but never with soap and never thoroughly cleaned. The clothes became so permeated with sweat, grease, and filth that they stood up on their own when removed. They harbored populations of fleas and lice that made their homes in the seams and folds of the fabric. Many peasants slept in their clothes, both for warmth and because they had no nightclothes. Brother Marcus of Fountains Abbey wrote in 1291 AD about offering shelter to a travelling peasant. His garments were so foul that we dared not allow him into the main hall, lest the stench overcome our brothers during prayers. We provided him with fresh straw in the stable, but even the horses seemed distressed by his presence. The monk noted that the peasant had worn the same tunic for so long that the original color was impossible to determine. Bedding was another horror. Most peasant families slept on straw mattresses that were changed perhaps twice a year, if at all. The straw became compressed and moldy, harboring insects and rodents. Blankets were made of rough wool that was rarely washed and often shared among the entire family. The single room where most peasant families lived served as bedroom, kitchen, workshop, and often stable for their animals. Pigs, chickens, and goats often shared the living space, especially in winter. The floor was usually packed dirt that absorbed every spill, every bodily fluid, every bit of organic matter that fell on it. Food preparation happened in this same contaminated space. Cooking pots were rarely properly cleaned. They were scraped out and perhaps rinsed with water, but never sanitized. Food was often prepared on surfaces that had just been used for other purposes, from changing babies to preparing animal feed. A merchant's account from Paris in 1342 AD describes visiting a peasant household to collect taxes. The woman was preparing our meal on the same table where a baby had just soiled itself, and where a chicken had been plucked the day before. She saw nothing amiss in this, and when I expressed concern, she looked at me as though I had spoken in tongues. Seasonal changes brought their own hygiene challenges. Summer meant sweat, flies, and the rapid spoilage of food. But winter was worse. Water froze, making even basic washing impossible. People huddled together for warmth, sharing not just body heat, but every disease and parasite among them. During the winter of 1315-1316 AD, known as the Great Famine, the chronicles record that people became so desperate for warmth that entire villages would crowd into a single building, A priest from Yorkshire wrote, 30 souls pressed into a space meant for 5, none having washed in months, all suffering from the flux and other ailments. The stench was so overwhelming that I could not complete the mass and had to retreat to the churchyard to breathe. Water in winter wasn't just scarce, it was dangerous. Breaking through ice to reach water could be fatal if you fell through. Carrying water in freezing temperatures often meant it froze before you reached home, and heating water required precious fuel that might be needed for cooking or keeping the family from freezing to death. Many peasants simply gave up on washing entirely during winter months. They wrapped themselves in whatever clothing and blankets they had and waited for spring. By the time the weather warmed, they had to be essentially excavated from their layers of clothing. Medical understanding of hygiene was virtually non-existent among the peasant class. The few medical texts that existed were written in Latin and available only to the educated elite. Most peasants relied on folk remedies that often made problems worse. For lice, some peasants would coat their hair with animal fat, believing it would suffocate the parasites. Instead, it created an even better breeding ground. For skin conditions, they might apply mud or animal dung, introducing new infections. For internal parasites, they might eat specific herbs or roots, some of which were actually effective, but many of which were poisonous. Eleanor de Montmorency, a peasant woman from Normandy whose name appears in a court record from 1298 AD, was accused of witchcraft partly because she claimed to know remedies for various ailments. Her cures included rubbing pig fat mixed with crushed beetles into infected wounds and giving children a tea made from moldy bread to drive out the worms. Some of her patients recovered despite her treatments, which only reinforced belief in her methods. Religious beliefs often conflicted with what little medical knowledge existed. Many peasants believed that suffering was divine punishment for sin, and that trying to alleviate that suffering was going against God's will. Cleanliness was sometimes seen as vanity, a sin in itself. A confessor's manual from 1285 AD warns priests to ask penitents whether they have taken excessive care in washing their bodies, for this shows pride and concern with worldly appearance, rather than the soul's salvation. Some peasants deliberately avoided washing as a form of religious devotion. St. Catherine of Siena, though not a peasant herself, exemplified this attitude when she refused to bathe for years as a form of penance. Her followers often imitated this practice, believing that physical filth demonstrated spiritual purity. Shame played almost no role in medieval peasant hygiene, simply because privacy didn't exist. Everyone could see, smell, and hear everything about everyone else's bodily functions. There was no embarrassment about body odor or visible dirt, because these were universal conditions. Children learned from birth that bodies were smelly, dirty, and uncomfortable. They never experienced the sensation of being truly clean, so they had no reference point for understanding what they were missing. A child might go their entire life without ever having a proper bath. Geoffrey de Ashby, whose childhood is documented in the records of a Yorkshire manor from 1334 AD, was noted by the local priest as being exceptional because his mother had washed him twice in his first 5 years of life. This wasn't criticism, it was praise for the mother's unusual dedication to her child's welfare. Women often bore the heaviest burden when it came to family hygiene, such as it was. They were expected to maintain whatever cleanliness was possible, while also managing all other household tasks. They carried water, managed the family's single change of clothing, attempted to keep food preparation areas somewhat clean, and dealt with the sanitary needs of infants and small children. But women also faced unique hygiene challenges that men didn't. During pregnancy and childbirth, when hygiene was most critical, they often had the least access to clean water and facilities. Breastfeeding mothers had to clean themselves and their babies with the same contaminated water and rough cloths used for everything else. The clothing of medieval peasants deserves special attention as a source of contamination. Wool was the primary material, and it was rarely processed properly. Raw wool contains lanolin and other natural oils that can harbor bacteria. When this wool was spun into thread and woven into fabric by amateur hands using primitive tools, the result was a rough, porous material that trapped every kind of organic matter. Linen was preferred when available, because it could be boiled to clean it, but linen was expensive, and most peasants couldn't afford it. Cotton didn't exist in Europe during most of the medieval period, so peasants wore wool that became more disgusting with each passing day. The seams of medieval clothing were hand-sewn with large stitches that created perfect hiding places for lice and fleas. The insects would lay eggs in these crevices, creating colonies that were almost impossible to eliminate. People could sometimes be seen picking lice from their clothing during church services or while working in the fields. Undergarments were virtually unknown among the peasant class. Men wore a long tunic over bare skin, women wore a long dress over bare skin. This meant that outer clothing absorbed every bodily secretion directly. Without undergarments to intercept sweat, menstrual blood, and other fluids, the outer clothing became saturated with organic matter that attracted insects and bred diseases. Even the process of making clothing was contaminated. Peasant women would spin thread using a drop spindle, often while walking or doing other tasks. The thread would drag on the ground, pick up dirt and debris, and be wound onto the spindle still contaminated. When this thread was woven into fabric, the contamination became part of the cloth itself. Dyeing fabric was sometimes attempted using local plants, but the process often involved letting plant matter rot in containers of urine or other organic liquids. The resulting dyes were not color-fast and would run when exposed to any moisture, creating new stains and odors on clothing that was already saturated with filth. Leather goods were another source of contamination. Most peasants owned some leather items, belts, shoes if they were fortunate, leather pouches for carrying items, but medieval leather tanning was a crude process that often left the leather partially rotted. Shoes in particular became breeding grounds for fungal infections. John Cobler, documented in the Guild records of Norwich from 1356 AD, was known for his work among the peasant class. His account books preserved in the city archives describe shoes that were more whole than leather, with soles so rotted that the wearer's foot touched the ground with each step. Yet these shoes were worn for years, repaired with whatever materials were available, until they literally fell apart. Housing conditions made personal hygiene virtually impossible. The typical peasant house was a single room with walls made of wood, mud, and straw. The roof was thatch that leaked constantly and harbored insects, rodents, and birds. There were no glass windows, just openings that were covered with cloth or wooden shutters when weather required it. The floor was packed earth that absorbed every liquid spilled on it. Cooking fires were built directly on this dirt floor, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof when the wind was favorable. More often, smoke filled the room, coating everything with soot and making breathing difficult. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a rough table, some stools, and a bed that was often just a straw mattress on the floor. Storage was in wooden boxes or baskets that offered no protection from insects or rodents. Food was stored in these same contaminated containers, ensuring that every meal included a healthy serving of whatever organisms were living in the storage areas. The walls of these houses often hosted their own ecosystems. The mud and straw mixture was perfect for insects, and the gaps between the materials provided nesting places for mice and rats. Some peasants deliberately encouraged certain insects to live in their walls, believing they would eat other, more harmful pests. Lighting was provided by rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat, that produced more smoke than light and filled the air with the smell of burning fat. Candles were too expensive for regular use. Most peasants lived by natural light during the day and in near darkness at night. Privacy for personal hygiene simply didn't exist. Families of 6 or 8 people lived in a single room where every activity was visible to everyone else. Children learned about adult bodily functions by watching their parents. Sick people suffered and died in full view of the healthy. Women gave birth while their other children watched. Even basic functions like urination and defecation had to be managed in this crowded space. Chamber pots were used at night and emptied in the morning, if the family owned a chamber pot. Otherwise, people simply went outside, regardless of weather, time of day, or their state of health. Seasonal illnesses made hygiene problems even worse. Winter brought respiratory infections that filled the confined space with the sound of coughing and the smell of infected breath. Summer brought digestive problems that created new sanitation challenges. Spring brought fevers as people's weakened bodies struggled to adapt to changing weather. During epidemic years, when plague or other diseases swept through peasant communities, hygiene became irrelevant because people were focused solely on survival. The famous chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, writing about the Black Death in 1348 AD, described peasant communities where the living were too few and too weak to bury the dead, who lay in their houses until the buildings themselves became tombs. But even during healthy years, the accumulation of organic matter in peasant homes created environments that were perfect for breeding disease. Straw on floors absorbed urine and feces from humans and animals. Food scraps attracted rats and insects. Standing water in containers bred mosquitoes and flies. Work made hygiene even more challenging. Peasant labor was dirty by its very nature. Farming involved working in soil that was fertilized with human and animal waste. Animal husbandry meant constant contact with manure, urine, and animal parasites. Food processing meant handling rotting organic matter with bare hands. During harvest season, peasants worked from dawn to dusk without breaks for washing. They ate with hands that had been handling grain, dirt, and animal waste all day. They drank from shared containers that were never properly cleaned. They slept in the fields when necessary, adding field dirt and insects to their already contaminated clothing. Women who worked in food production faced particular challenges. Dairy work involved handling milk that spoiled quickly in the heat. Brewing ale required working with fermenting organic matter that attracted every kind of pest. Food preservation involved salting meat and fish in environments that were already contaminated with bacteria. Even the tools peasants used for work were sources of contamination. Wooden implements absorbed organic matter and were impossible to clean properly. Metal tools were precious and were used for many different purposes, spreading contamination from one task to another. A knife used to slaughter animals might be used later to prepare food, without any cleaning in between. Water sources near peasant communities were contaminated by runoff from fields that were fertilized with human waste. The same streams that provided drinking water also received the outflow from primitive latrines and animal yards. During dry seasons, these water sources became concentrated pools of disease. Swimming or bathing in natural water sources was dangerous, not just because of contamination, but because peasants rarely learned to swim. Drowning was a common cause of death, especially among children, who fell into wells or streams while trying to collect water. Trade and travel spread hygiene problems from community to community. Merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers carried diseases and parasites with them wherever they went. A single infected person could introduce new strains of illness to isolated peasant communities that had no resistance to foreign diseases. Markets and fairs were particular hazards. Hundreds of people would gather in small spaces, sharing food, water, and air. Animals were brought for sale, adding their own parasites and diseases to the mix. Food vendors operated without any understanding of sanitation, preparing meals with contaminated hands and utensils. Religious gatherings also spread contamination. Churches were crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where people pressed together for hours. The practice of sharing communion wine from a common cup meant that every communicant was exposed to the saliva and breath of everyone who had drunk before them. Pilgrimages were exercises in shared suffering. Groups of people would travel for weeks or months, sharing food, water, and sleeping spaces. They had no opportunity to wash properly or change clothes. Many pilgrims died not from the rigors of travel, but from diseases spread within their own group. War made hygiene problems catastrophic. Armies of peasant soldiers lived in conditions that made their home villages seem clean by comparison. They shared latrines, water sources, and sleeping areas with hundreds of other men. They wore the same clothes for months without changing. They ate food that was often spoiled and always contaminated. Military camps were breeding grounds for epidemic disease. The chronicler Froissart, writing about the 100 Years' War, described English camps where more men died from flux and fever than from French weapons. Medieval armies often dissolved, not because of battlefield defeats, but because disease made them unable to continue fighting. Siege warfare was even worse. Besieged populations were trapped in confined spaces with limited water and food. Sanitation systems broke down completely. Bodies of the dead were often left unburied because there was nowhere to bury them safely. Disease spread so rapidly that sieges often ended when the defenders were too sick to man the walls. Economic factors made hygiene a luxury that most peasants couldn't afford. Soap cost money. Clean water required time and labor to obtain. Fuel for heating water was expensive. New clothing was beyond most peasants' means. Even basic items like combs or scissors were precious possessions that few families owned. The economic system itself perpetuated poor hygiene. Peasants owed labor to their lords and had little time for personal care. They paid taxes in the form of agricultural products, leaving them with barely enough food to survive. Any money they earned went for necessities like tools or seed grain, not for hygiene supplies. Seasonal variations in food availability affected hygiene in unexpected ways. During spring famines, when stored food ran out and new crops weren't ready, peasants ate anything they could find. This included spoiled grain, wild plants that caused digestive problems, and sometimes substances that weren't really food at all. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to skin diseases and infections. Vitamin deficiencies caused specific hygiene problems. Scurvy led to bleeding gums and loose teeth. Pellagra caused skin lesions. Rickets weakened bones and made movement painful. During good harvest years, peasants might overeat to prepare for the lean months ahead. But sudden changes in diet also caused digestive problems. Rich foods after months of near starvation led to diarrhea and vomiting. Even success brought its own hygiene challenges. Marriage and family life were conducted in conditions that seem impossible to modern people. Courtship took place in public because privacy didn't exist. Wedding nights happened in single-room houses where the entire extended family was present. Childbirth was attended by female relatives and neighbors who brought their own contamination to the process. Children were born into contaminated environments and were exposed to every disease and parasite from their first breath. Infant mortality was partly so high because babies' immune systems couldn't cope with the assault of organisms they encountered immediately after birth. Those children who survived infancy grew up in conditions that seemed designed to prevent healthy development. They crawled on floors contaminated with human and animal waste. They put dirty objects in their mouths because everything in their environment was dirty. They shared beds with siblings who might be carrying communicable diseases. Education about hygiene was non-existent for peasant children. They learnt by watching their parents, who knew little about cleanliness themselves. Harmful practices were passed down through generations because no one understood why people got sick or how diseases spread. Coming of age brought new challenges. Adolescent boys began working in the fields and animal yards, exposing them to new sources of contamination. Girls began managing household hygiene tasks without any real knowledge of how to perform them safely. Marriage for peasant women often meant pregnancy within the first year, followed by repeated pregnancies with minimal recovery time between them. Each pregnancy and birth took place in the same contaminated conditions, weakening women's bodies and making them more susceptible to infection. Old age, for those peasants who lived long enough to reach it, brought special hygiene challenges. Elderly people lost the strength to carry water and maintain even basic cleanliness. They became incontinent, but had no resources for managing bodily functions. They developed sores from lying in contaminated bedding, but had no clean dressings for wounds. Families cared for elderly relatives as best they could, but this often meant that healthy family members were exposed to whatever diseases or conditions the elderly person had developed. A single sick grandparent could infect an entire household. Death itself was a hygiene challenge. Bodies were washed and prepared for burial by family members who had no understanding of how disease spread. Wakes were held in the same rooms where families lived, exposing everyone to whatever had killed the deceased. Burials were in crowded churchyards, where the soil was saturated with decomposing organic matter. During epidemic years, normal burial practices became impossible. Bodies were buried in mass graves or simply abandoned. The living were too sick to care for the dead properly, creating new sources of contamination that spread disease even further. Yet despite all these horrors, medieval peasants developed remarkable resilience. Their immune systems, constantly challenged by exposure to pathogens, became adapted to their environment in ways that protected them from some diseases while leaving them vulnerable to others. Children who survived their first few years often developed resistance to local diseases that would kill outsiders. Peasant communities sometimes remained relatively healthy, while epidemics devastated urban areas or other regions, simply because they had been exposed to similar diseases before. The human body's ability to adapt was both a blessing and a curse. Peasants could function while carrying parasite loads that would incapacitate modern people. They could work while suffering from chronic infections. They could reproduce and raise children while living in conditions that seem impossible for human survival. But this adaptation came at a tremendous cost. Life expectancy was short. Infant mortality was horrific. Chronic pain and illness were universal. Physical development was stunted by malnutrition and disease. Mental development was limited by the constant stress of survival. Innovation in hygiene did occur, but slowly and often by accident. Peasants discovered that certain herbs had medical properties. They learned that some practices led to better health outcomes. They developed techniques for food preservation and water storage that reduced contamination. But innovation was limited by lack of education, limited resources, and cultural resistance to change. Most peasants lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. They had little exposure to different practices or ideas. Knowledge was passed down orally and was often distorted or lost entirely. The few peasants who attempted to improve their hygiene often faced suspicion from their neighbors. Unusual cleanliness might be seen as vanity or even witchcraft. Standing out from the community in any way was dangerous in a society where conformity was essential for survival. Religious institutions sometimes provided models for better hygiene, but these were usually inaccessible to peasants. Monasteries had rules about cleanliness and sometimes had better water supplies and sanitation systems, but peasants rarely had contact with monastic communities except as laborers or beggars. Medical knowledge, such as it was, remained locked away in Latin texts that peasants couldn't read. Folk medicine was sometimes effective, but was often harmful. Without understanding the principles behind medical treatments, peasants couldn't distinguish between helpful and harmful practices. Seasonal celebrations and religious festivals sometimes included ritual washing, but these occasions were rare and often more symbolic than practical. A peasant might wash for Easter or before a wedding, but these were exceptional events, not regular practices. The contrast between medieval peasant hygiene and the standards of the modern world is so extreme that it's difficult to comprehend. Modern people worry about being clean enough, while medieval peasants had no concept of what clean meant. We take for granted things like soap, clean water, and regular bathing that were impossible luxuries for our ancestors. Yet medieval peasants were not ignorant or careless people. They were survivors, adapting to impossible circumstances with remarkable ingenuity. They developed strategies for living in contaminated environments that kept them alive when less adaptable people died. They created communities that functioned despite conditions that would destroy modern societies. Their methods were often crude, but they were based on centuries of accumulated experience. They knew which water sources were safest during different seasons. They understood which foods were most likely to spoil and cause illness. They recognized the signs of dangerous diseases and had developed isolation practices that sometimes prevented epidemics from spreading. Women, in particular, developed sophisticated knowledge about managing family health within severe constraints. They knew how to stretch limited resources to keep their families as clean as possible. They understood which herbs might help with various ailments. They had techniques for food preparation and preservation that maximized nutrition while minimizing contamination. Midwives, despite working in contaminated conditions, often developed practices that improved survival rates for mothers and babies. They might not understand the principles of sterility, but they learnt through experience which techniques led to better outcomes. Some midwives were remarkably successful, given their limitations. Master craftsmen in peasant communities sometimes developed better hygiene practices out of necessity. Blacksmiths learned to clean wounds caused by metal splinters and burns. Millers understood the importance of keeping grain dry and free from rodent contamination. Brewers developed techniques for preventing their ale from spoiling. Even in the darkest periods of medieval history, there were individuals who pushed against the limitations of their time. Some peasants experimented with different washing techniques. Others tried to improve their water sources. A few attempted to build better housing that would be easier to keep clean. But these innovations were always constrained by the fundamental realities of medieval peasant life: poverty, ignorance, limited resources, and social systems that offered little opportunity for change. Most peasants were trapped in cycles of contamination and disease that had persisted for generations and would continue long after their deaths. The seasonal cycle of peasant life created its own rhythm of hygiene challenges. Spring brought the mud season, when melting snow and spring rains turned the ground into a swamp of contaminated water and organic matter. Peasants tracked this mud into their homes on their feet and clothing, spreading contamination throughout their living spaces. Summer brought flies and other insects in overwhelming numbers. These insects bred in the human and animal waste that accumulated around peasant settlements. They landed on food, crawled over sleeping people, and spread disease from house to house. The heat also accelerated the decomposition of organic matter, creating new odors and attracting more pests. Autumn was harvest time, when peasants worked frantically to gather crops before winter arrived. This meant working with dirty hands from dawn to dusk, eating contaminated food in the fields, and sleeping wherever they could find shelter. The urgency of harvest left no time for personal care. Winter brought different challenges. Confined spaces, reduced ventilation, and the impossibility of washing created conditions where respiratory diseases spread rapidly through peasant communities. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing not just body heat but every pathogen among them. The agricultural calendar dominated every aspect of peasant life, including hygiene. During plowing season, peasants worked in fields that had been fertilized with human waste. During planting, they handled seeds with the same hands they used for all other tasks. During weeding, they spent hours bent over in contaminated soil. Animal husbandry added another layer of contamination to peasant life. Pigs, which were common in peasant households, were particularly filthy animals that carried numerous parasites and diseases. They often shared living spaces with human families, contributing their own waste and parasites to the household ecosystem. Chickens were somewhat cleaner than pigs, but they still carried lice, mites, and internal parasites that could spread to humans. They also attracted rats and other vermin that competed with peasant families for food and shelter. Cattle and sheep were usually kept in separate buildings, but these animals still required daily care that brought peasants into contact with contaminated bedding, animal waste, and parasites. Milking cows was particularly hazardous because it required direct contact with animals that were often infested with insects and carrying diseases. The tools used for animal care were rarely cleaned properly. Wooden implements absorbed organic matter and became breeding grounds for bacteria. Metal tools were too precious to risk damage from aggressive cleaning. Most tools were simply wiped off and used again, spreading contamination from animal to animal and from animals to humans. Food production and preservation created additional hygiene challenges. Meat preservation required techniques like salting, smoking, and drying that took place in contaminated environments. A pig slaughtered in autumn might be processed on tables that had been used for other purposes, with tools that had been used for farm work, by people whose hands were caked with dirt, and worse, the process of making sausages involved stuffing ground meat into animal intestines that had been cleaned only with water, if at all. The grinding was done by hand, often by children whose small hands could fit into the grinding equipment. The meat was seasoned with herbs that had been dried in contaminated storage areas. Dairy products were particularly dangerous because milk spoiled quickly and provided perfect breeding conditions for harmful bacteria. Peasant women made cheese and butter using milk from cows that were often sick or malnourished. The processing equipment was made of wood that absorbed organic matter and was impossible to sterilize. Grain storage was another source of contamination. Wheat, barley, and other grains were stored in wooden containers that also housed rodents, insects, and their waste. The grain itself often became moldy during storage, producing toxins that caused illness and death. Bread making involved using this contaminated grain, grinding it with stones that were never properly cleaned, and mixing the flour with water that was brown with sediment and organic matter. The dough was kneaded by hands that had been used for every other household task, then baked in ovens that were shared by multiple families and rarely cleaned. Even the simplest meals were exercises in contamination. Pottage, the thick stew that was the staple food of medieval peasants, was made by throwing whatever ingredients were available into a pot that was never properly cleaned between uses. Vegetables pulled from gardens fertilized with human waste, grain infected with ergot and other fungi, and scraps of meat that might have been spoiling for days all went into the same pot. The cooking process itself was contaminated. Wooden spoons absorbed organic matter and became breeding grounds for bacteria. Clay pots were porous and absorbed whatever had been cooked in them previously. Metal pots were rare and precious, used for multiple purposes without cleaning between uses. Eating utensils were almost non-existent among the peasant class. Most food was eaten with fingers that had been used for every other purpose. Knives were shared among family members and used for eating, food preparation, and general household tasks. Spoons were often carved from wood that had been used for other purposes. Water for drinking and cooking came from the same contaminated sources used for everything else. It was stored in wooden containers that harbored bacteria and parasites. During times of scarcity, families might use the same water for multiple purposes, increasing the concentration of contaminants with each use. The social aspects of medieval peasant life made hygiene problems worse. Shared labor meant that contamination spread rapidly through communities. Harvest crews worked together in close quarters, sharing tools, food, and water. Building projects brought groups of peasants together to work with contaminated materials and equipment. Religious obligations required peasants to gather in crowded churches where diseases spread rapidly. The practice of kissing religious relics meant that hundreds of people might put their mouths on the same contaminated objects. Confession involved close contact between peasants and priests, who moved from house to house, potentially carrying diseases with them. Social celebrations were opportunities for contamination to spread throughout entire communities. Wedding feasts involved sharing food that had been prepared in contaminated conditions by multiple families. Funeral wakes required people to gather in close quarters with bodies that might have died from communicable diseases. Markets and fairs brought together people from multiple communities, creating opportunities for new strains of disease to spread from region to region. Food vendors operated without any understanding of sanitation, selling meals that had been prepared with contaminated ingredients and cooked with dirty utensils. The legal system itself sometimes created hygiene problems. Punishment for crimes often involved public humiliation that exposed both criminals and spectators to contamination. Stocks and pillories were shared equipment that had been used by numerous previous victims. Public executions drew crowds of people who pressed together in small spaces. Even attempts at medical treatment often made hygiene problems worse. Barber surgeons used the same instruments on multiple patients without cleaning them between uses. Bloodletting was performed with lancets that carried diseases from person to person. Wound treatment involved applying contaminated bandages and ointments that introduced new infections. Folk remedies often involved substances that were inherently contaminated. Animal dung was applied to wounds based on the belief that it would draw out infection. Urine was used as an antiseptic, despite being contaminated with bacteria and parasites. Moldy bread was eaten to treat various ailments, sometimes with beneficial results but often with harmful ones. The cumulative effect of all these factors was a population that lived in constant contact with disease and contamination. Medieval peasants were walking repositories of bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. Their bodies hosted communities of organisms that modern people would find horrifying. Yet they persisted, they survived, they reproduced and raised children who grew up to face the same challenges. They created communities that functioned despite conditions that seem impossible for human habitation. They developed cultures rich in music, storytelling, and art, even while living in conditions of unimaginable filth. Their resilience was remarkable, but it came at a terrible cost. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was high, and chronic illness was universal. Physical suffering was so common that it was considered a normal part of human existence. Mental development was limited by the constant stress of survival in a contaminated environment. The knowledge that existed about hygiene and disease prevention was limited to the educated elite, who had little contact with peasant communities. Medical texts written in Latin were incomprehensible to people who couldn't read in any language. Scientific understanding was primitive and often wrong, even among the most educated people of the time. Trade networks sometimes spread useful knowledge along with goods, but this information was often distorted as it passed from person to person. A technique that worked in one region might be harmful in another due to different environmental conditions. Without understanding the principles behind hygienic practices, peasants couldn't adapt techniques to their specific circumstances. The economic system provided no incentives for improving peasant hygiene. Lords who controlled peasant communities were interested in agricultural production and tax collection, not in the health and welfare of their workers. As long as enough peasants survived to work the fields and pay taxes, there was no economic reason to invest in better living conditions. The church, which was the dominant cultural institution of medieval Europe, had a complex relationship with cleanliness. Some religious orders emphasized cleanliness as a form of spiritual discipline, but others viewed physical suffering as spiritually beneficial. The prevailing attitude toward peasant hygiene was often one of resignation to divine will. Technical innovations that might have improved peasant hygiene were slow to develop and slower to spread. Better plows, improved crop rotations, and more effective building techniques gradually made life easier for some peasants, but these changes took centuries to implement and often benefited only the most prosperous peasant families. The isolation of peasant communities meant that innovations developed in one region might never spread to other areas. Knowledge that could have saved lives remained localized because there were no effective systems for sharing information across distances. Even when better techniques were available, peasants often lacked the resources to implement them. Improved housing required materials and skilled labor that most peasant families couldn't afford. Better water sources required community cooperation and investment that was difficult to organize. Improved food preservation techniques required equipment and supplies that were beyond most peasants' means. The result was a system that perpetuated poor hygiene across generations. Children learned contaminated practices from their parents and passed them on to their own children. Communities developed cultures that normalized conditions which were actually dangerous to human health. Breaking out of these cycles required not just individual effort, but fundamental changes in economic, social, and political systems. These changes would eventually come, but not for centuries after the period we've been examining. The medieval peasant families we followed through their daily struggles had no way of knowing that their descendants would eventually live in a world where clean water, soap, and basic sanitation were available to ordinary people. For Guillaume de Montfort, carrying brown water from the Oise River to his family in 1352 AD, the idea that water could run clear and clean from a tap inside his house would have seemed like magic. For Marie de Coucy, scrubbing herself raw with sand and cold water, the concept of hot running water and soap would have been incomprehensible. For Agnes the soap maker, who made soap for others while remaining unwashed and verminous herself, the notion that every person might own soap and use it daily would have seemed impossible. For Isabella Farnham, whose hair moved with living vermin during Mass, the idea of shampoo and conditioner would have been beyond imagination. These were not ignorant people. They were survivors who had adapted to impossible circumstances with remarkable ingenuity. They had developed strategies for living that kept them alive in environments that would kill unprepared modern people within days. They created communities, raised families, and built cultures that produced some of the greatest art and literature in human history. But they did all of this while living in conditions of filth that we can barely imagine. They suffered from diseases that we have forgotten existed. They experienced physical discomfort that was so constant they didn't recognize it as abnormal. They died from causes that we now prevent with simple hygiene practices. As you sit in your clean home, having taken a hot shower with soap and shampooed your hair with products that would have seemed miraculous to medieval peasants, it's worth remembering Guillaume and Marie and Agnes and Isabella. They were your ancestors, the people whose struggles and survival made your existence possible. They carried water that would kill you. They wore clothes that would make you violently ill. They lived in houses that would be condemned as uninhabitable by modern standards. They ate food that would poison you and breathed air that would damage your lungs. Yet they persisted. They survived. They loved their families and celebrated their joys and mourned their losses, all while living in the midst of contamination that we can barely comprehend. They were human beings like us, facing impossible challenges with courage and determination. And in their single room, where the straw rustles beneath bodies that haven't been properly clean in years, where the smell of unwashed humanity mingles with rotting thatch and worse things, a mother still coughs in the pre-dawn darkness. Her children still wake to hunger and itching, and the endless grinding challenge of surviving another day in a world where cleanliness is not just impossible, it's unimaginable. The rooster crows again, though dawn still seems hours away. Another day begins in medieval Europe, and the cycle continues, as it has for generations, as it will for generations more, until time and change finally bring clean water running from taps, soap in every household, and the blessed relief of simply being clean.